art, culture, and especially the development of the church and Christianity. And so starting out our time here at St. Paul's is really a wonderful way of seeing those connections that we've already been talking about. So I'm going to try to just provide a little bit of a basic overview. Our students have already had some introduction, so forgive me if there are some pieces missing as we move forward. But I am going to give a kind of focus on the mosaics that you see at the front of the church, because in a sense they are some of the best known aspects of the art that you actually see everywhere in this church. Just a little bit of kind of background about the church. The church was built in the 1870s. The building itself, as the first Protestant church to be built within the walls of Rome, after the unification of Italy, and where it was possible for freedom of worship, those who were not necessarily a part of the Catholic Church, to have houses of worship and actually build structures for worship within the walls of Rome. And it's actually pretty significant that the church that had actually been meeting informally, a church of expats, of Americans and then British primarily, who had either settled permanently or were in residence here in Rome, decided that they needed a kind of permanent home. And they chose the name St. Paul's for the church. It had previously been called Grace Chapel when they met informally, the congregation. But when they were able to build a building and in a sense be a public presence in the city of Rome, they chose the name St. Paul's because of the importance of Paul within the Protestant tradition in particular as a theologian, and also because there was not a St. Paul's within the walls. There is a St. Paul's outside of the walls of Rome. They also wanted to distinguish themselves because the term grace would specifically be associated in the Catholic tradition with Mary, Santa Maria delle Grazie, of the graces, and so they wanted to make sure that there wasn't a confusion about, the kind of theological kind of framework and background. So there's a lot simply there in the name that we're dealing with. So the architecture, just a couple of quick things, because the building was built by Americans and British primarily as a congregation, is a combination of British Victorian architecture. So you'll see a lot of kind of aspects of the brickwork, the general kind of design and structure, the layout, that imitates a lot of things that you would see, especially in Great Britain and to some extent in the United States. But there are a couple of things that are distinctively Italian, because they're trying to bridge this kind of relationship between the Anglo kind of tradition and the Italians, the Protestant and the Catholic, or the Anglican and Catholic. And so, for example, here, if you take a look at the interior and the exterior, you'll see that the basic structure itself is made out of brick and stone, and you have this really strong patterning and especially the striping of the interior, which we're also going to be seeing for my group of students here in other Italian churches, very specifically at Orvieto. So there is this kind of combining of traditions that we're seeing here in the church. The rest of the decoration that you're seeing was commissioned and then produced through various kinds of stages through the next several decades into the early 20th century. And as was mentioned already today, It has, since my last visit to Rome before COVID, most of the art and the architecture has been cleaned, and so everybody's seeing this in largely pristine condition, in terms of the brightness of the colors without the soot of candles and, urban pollution and things like that are an overlay even in a relatively short period of time within a church that uses all kinds of practices in their worship involving candles, as we saw today, and lots of other kinds of physical substances. So it's a real delight to be able to see everything a little bit more clearly, a little bit more brightly, and to really see what was actually referred to as the exquisite excess of especially Edward Burne-Jones mosaics that you see here at the front of the church. That's a term that was used. And what was also referred to as the preternatural imagination of Burne-Jones, who did those as well. Preternatural meaning beyond natural, meaning to signal something beyond what exists in this world as a bridging between earth and heaven. And so we see that everywhere here. As you look around the church, even though I'm going to focus mostly on the mosaics here, you'll notice that virtually every surface is covered in pattern or design or imagery of some sort, including the floors here. And that, again, is very, very common as we've looked at to a Catholic kind of tradition where the church really embodies God's glory. It's the place both where you encounter it, but where you also acknowledge it. And so as you look around this space, you see unity in variety, a kind of unity of the way things work together, but tremendous variety as you take a look at different art forms. And even if you take a look at the columns that are holding up the pulpits here, you'll see each column is different and rather than the same. And so that idea, that theological concept of unity and variety is embedded in every aspect of what you're encountering. We're seeing aspects of 19th century art forms, like in the tile work that you see along the lower sides of the British arts and crafts movement that some of you may be familiar with, as well as references to ancient Roman mosaics in the earth tones of the stone mosaics that then get transformed in the early Christian church by raising those mosaics to the walls and the ceilings, transforming them by using, instead of natural colored stones, to use tinted glass, precious gems, gilded glass, again, to reflect the kind of glory of God, lifting it upward, to lift our eyes heavenward, but also to reflect that kind of transformation that we have in Christ and through God. So a couple of things, again, as some of the general sketch of what you're seeing around you. Because this church is dedicated to Paul, to St. Paul, the stained glass windows are essentially rendering scenes from the life of Paul as they're described in the book of Acts. And so you're seeing the story of Paul's life, the apostle, who brings the good news to the Gentiles, even as a Jew who first rejects Christ and then is himself transformed by a miraculous encounter with Christ. So we have that sketching of the life of Christ along the stained glass windows. At the back of the church, if you want to turn around, we have some mosaics by a different artist from the ones at the front. where we're basically seeing the nativity and the annunciation, the nativity, and then flanked by the shepherds and the magi. So the fact that we're here celebrating Epiphany, and you should have noticed in the service all of the references to the kings in the scriptures that were read, to the songs that were sung, to the sermon, this emphasis of that final group that is coming to acknowledge a kind of global sovereignty of the Christ child who has been born. And so we see those scenes rendered at the back of the church. And then in the rose window, we see other kinds of references to the book of Revelation and again, Christ's sovereignty in the rose, the stained glass rose above that, flanked by Bethlehem and Jerusalem, the two holy cities of God on earth. So we want to keep that in view. Now, it's really hard for me as an art historian to not be talking and looking at what I'm talking about. So this is a little bit unnatural for me, so bear with me a little bit. So I want to turn our view to the mosaics that we have here at the front. But before I do that, I want to point out that behind the group that we're seeing having their photograph taken, there is actually a small mosaic that is an empty throne with a cross embedded at it. And for my students, I want you to be looking at this image and then be looking for this image at Santa Maria Maggiore when we're there this afternoon. Because that concept that the church is waiting for Christ's return is present in a really significant way in both the Catholic tradition, the Anglican tradition, and then certainly within the Protestant tradition that most of my students come from. As we look at the mosaics then, what you're going to see here, the mosaics were produced or commissioned from an artist named Edward Burne-Jones even as the church was itself being built as a structure. And so he worked on the design for the mosaics over a long period of time and then kind of rolling them out in succession as there were funds and other opportunities to finish aspects of the project. Edward Burne-Jones was a member of a movement, a 19th century movement called the Pre-Raphaelite movement. And that name is really important, Pre-Raphaelite movement. It was a British movement, and the name basically refers to this group of artists in the latter part of the 19th century who were looking to revivify the artistic tradition and especially the Christian tradition with a kind of growing secularism, that was setting in with industrialization and other things that were happening, especially in Northern Europe. And so these artists looked to the period before Raphael, pre-Raphaelite, again, is the term. So before the year 1500, roughly, the Middle Ages as a focus, as representing, in a sense, a more authentic, kind of direct approach to dealing with Christian faith and Christian subject in this kind of renewal movement. And so you're seeing artists who are looking to the past, but they are also trying to bring it into the present in a fresh kind of way to revivify tradition and make it relevant to their own time. And so we see lots and lots of references to the long tradition of Christian imagery, but also a reinvention, so to speak, both of aspects of the form, mosaics, how you make mosaics, what you can do with them, and then also the treatment of different subjects. So in terms of understanding the general scheme of Burne-Jones mosaics, we need to have a little bit of context about the times and when this church was being established. Why do we have all of these Americans and British who are spending time in Italy, specifically in Rome, sometimes settling here permanently? Partly has to do with the Industrial Revolution. These peoples were attracted to Italy because the Industrial Revolution had not laid hold of this region in quite the same way as it had in the north. You didn't have the pollution and all of the ills that were starting to be felt from urbanization and migrations from the countryside to the cities, things that are still commonplace all around the world where those phenomena are happening today. And you also had these elites, in a sense, from those places who had been coming to Europe, in a sense, and to Italy very specifically, to learn about the long tradition of the West, its history from antiquity, ancient Greece and Rome, through the grand tour for British elites and aristocracy as a kind of, you might call it a gap year or two, as they are getting ready to step into their responsibilities as adults and as adult leaders within their society. So it was seen to visit all of these sites, spend time in them, learn about these things as a preparation for those responsibilities. And then to some extent, Americans followed as we start to see America prospering and developing its own kind of elite. So that's partly why you have this enclave of especially wealthy and fairly powerful people who are making their homes in Rome and establishing the church here. So all of that sets the stage for how you can think about this particular program of mosaics here that Burne-Jones puts together, certainly with a lot of help and input from the various rectors that he worked with and other people affiliated with the church. To do that is responding to this idea that the world is a wilderness, and the world was really being seen as an ongoing wilderness because of the kind of effects of things like industrialization and what it was doing to cities, to people's lives, to nations, the ongoing kind of turmoil. And so that theme of both God's provision while we as human beings are in this world, living in the wilderness, and then the promise of transformation as we prepare for our eternal home. And then the third element would be the role of the church in this whole period. So having that in view is really helpful. So when we take a look at the general progression of how these mosaics were designed and finished and installed, you essentially start with the mosaic that is at the top and the closest to you that was produced first. And then we move forward and then down. That's how this was created over several decades. And installed in the church. So the first mosaic that you see over the arch here is an Annunciation scene, but it's a truly unique Annunciation scene. We're going to see lots of Annunciations in our 2 weeks here, but this is a scene where the Annunciation, where Gabriel comes to Mary to tell her that she has been chosen to bear the Christ child. Takes place in a desert landscape. So again, think wilderness, the wilderness of this world after human beings have been cast out of the Garden of Eden and all of the realities. So we see a wilderness landscape. We see Mary, who has walked out of the gates of the city, as women typically did in ancient times, in order to get water from the well and bring it back to their families, to their community, that living water that allowed them to function as the action that she is engaged in. And so she is out there alone, and Gabriel comes to her to announce this news. And so you'll see these little puddles of water here out in this desert landscape, that provision, even if it seems very spare, that is always present. On the left-hand side, the far left-hand side up there, you'll see that there is a pelican with a little baby pelican. And the pelican is a kind of traditional symbol of Christ, because according to tradition, pelicans will peck their breasts to open up a blood vessel. Think about the symbolism there, in order to feed their young. So this is Christ's blood, that is then provided for the life and the nurture of others being referenced, even as Gabriel is announcing the coming of Christ that is now going to occur into the world. So there is a tradition of this kind of desert landscape, but it tends to be an Eastern tradition from North African and Byzantine churches, not Western churches, that is incorporated here, and one of the many kind of rich sources that we see in what we have around us. So the next mosaic then, again, push further back at the top. You'll see, if you can glimpse it, and you can come up afterwards to look a little bit more closely, you'll see a big tree with a figure of Christ with his hands outstretched in the form that he would have taken on the cross, suspended in front of the tree. And what's significant here is that this is often referred to as the tree of life, and that's not an inappropriate kind of designation here. But Burne-Jones actually referred to it as the tree of forgiveness. And that really does reflect, in a sense, the significance of what he's bringing together. This incredibly kind of verdant tree that is behind him, green, beyond all kinds of green, with just full of leaves, and then the sacrifice that now makes that life available to all. If you look on either side, I have to remind myself, okay, on either side, you'll see Adam on the left, and you'll see Eve on the right, and we'll see a kind of reference both to the consequences of their original sin in the Garden of Eden, their rejection, so to speak, of the one prohibition that God gave to them. On the left, we see Adam, and to the far left, you'll see these kind of waving forms, kind of a tan color. Those are sheaves of wheat. And so you're seeing the toil that Adam is having to engage in now as the consequence of his sin in order to fulfill his responsibilities. And that there are thistles there, emphasizing again the difficulty that life will entail, now that human beings are separated from that perfect provision and relationship with God. And then on the right, you see Eve, and she has her firstborn son with her. So a reference to the generations that will come. And then there are two plants that are represented there, olives and myrtle, in that section. And that's really significant because olives in the Mediterranean world and Italy are a source of fundamental provision of food and all kinds of other necessary and good things. And then the myrtle plant was actually used for producing textiles for clothing. So again, two forms of provision that God is making, but two things that also would resonate very much with the local context and the Italian people as specific to them. Moving downward then to the rounded arch form that you see, we're seeing Christ enthroned in the heavenly Jerusalem in the upper section. And so this rounded section, the apse, that again is following architectural ecclesial tradition, we have, in a sense, the most holy space being indicated by that rounded space at the end of the church. And we see Christ enthroned references to the book of Revelation as an example in the center. And you'll see the figure of Christ here in his left hand holding an orb of the earth, the orb of sovereignty that comes from imperial tradition in the Roman Empire. But you'll see also that there is a desert landscape there again. So the world that he is presiding over in this time is this kind of wilderness that will then be transformed. And then his right hand is lifted in a really, really common gesture that students will start to recognize with the two fingers upraised, the gesture of blessing. So wilderness, but Christ who is blessing this people, this place, the whole creation, even in this period of waiting between the original creation and the final fulfillment when Christ returns. You'll see that surrounding him are 6 little niches, and those are all angels, several of whom are named in the biblical text, a couple of who are just more general kinds of representations. And you'll see that 2 of them are actually warrior angels. They are holding weapons. They are guarding heaven. So why does heaven need to be guarded? Well, the one angel, the angel of light, Lucifer, who is God's special delight in a certain kind of way, again, has fallen, and we see this kind of profoundly stark reference to Lucifer. I'll see if my pointer is working here or not. I'm having some trouble with it. Sorry. But on our left, you'll see this dark kind of empty void. That was where Lucifer should have stood. And it's a stark kind of reminder of the significance of what has happened when he chooses to reject his proper place in the order of things. Now, what's really interesting about that is that Burne-Jones originally intended to include in his program, but it was never able to be produced, a reference to Lucifer on the back wall and to the fall of the angels, so that when people would leave the church, they would be reminded of the power that Lucifer currently has in the world around us and the kind of devastation, in a sense, that you step out into in the larger world. But that particular mosaic was never able to be produced. There is a painting of that that's really worth taking a look at, especially for my students. It's really Dante-esque, in what you're seeing, and so you may want to take a look at that online. So a few more things as we move further down. You'll see Christ on the throne, surrounded by cherubim and seraphim. as his kind of glory, constantly singing his praises, the heavenly host of angels above, and then flowing from that throne, the four rivers, the water of life that comes down into the world. And then we also see the rainbow that surrounds those waters, produced in this just incredible technique of producing transparency. Look through that rainbow. It's presented to us, even though those are just single tiles of glass and stone that you're put together, that effect of looking through the light of a rainbow. And of course, the rainbow from the Old Testament, the story of Noah, the first destruction of the earthly creation because of human sin, as a promise. So again, this is a statement of promise, a reminder of promise to the creation that is still in this period of waiting. You'll notice that there are several inscriptions, and I can go through those, but there is the inscription that is with the Annunciation, actually refers to this wilderness that we're a part of. So it's reminding people of that wilderness context. The Annunciation inscription that's below is, again, the promise that is now being fulfilled, being referred to in the Annunciation to Mary of the coming of the Christ child. And then the inscription that you see, this gold band that is just beneath the kind of living waters that are flowing down in the rainbow. On the left-hand side, it reads right to left. So what language might that be? Hebrew, right? Okay, you can read the text, all right? And then on the right, you'll see that there is Greek text. So you have this starting at the center, flowing both directions. The Hebrew, Old Testament reference, the Greek, New Testament reference. In the beginning, God created, right? So this is a reference in the Hebrew, Genesis 1:1, and then the Greek on the right from the book of John, the Gospel of John. We see in the beginning was the Word, right? Christ Jesus, and relating those two things. So both the way those are organized, the use of Hebrew and Greek is really important, but also the significance of those two texts in terms of relating the Creator with the Redeemer, and all that Christ is really significant. So moving downward then, we see in this kind of horizontal band, we see a subject that's often referred to as the triumph of the church, and is referring then to the significance of the role of the church down through the ages and into the present until, again, that second coming that we are waiting for, that the throne below, the empty throne below, is reminding us of. So what we see in this lowest register is 5 basic groupings of people that are kind of traditional categories that have been well established by church tradition in understanding the role of the church, even before the church as we think of it was established following Christ's life and death and resurrection. So on the far left, and you'll have to come over here, you're seeing the ascetic saints, the desert saints, as they're often referred to. And these will include Old Testament prophets, who were often, out in the desert for periods of time or outcast, but also some of the, early saints of the church. And so those are the ones, and you'll see their hands raised up because they're exhorting both human beings and God, even in this wilderness that we are a part of in this world. The second group to the right is a group of women, and these are the holy matrons. And this is a group that refers to the work of ordinary Christians to sustain others and the church as we move through our lives. And so we see certain biblical figures that are referred to, Mary Magdalene, and identified by her jar of nard, because according to tradition, the woman who did that was Mary Magdalene. We also see Martha with her keys, because Martha was a responsible woman, right? A responsible woman taking care of daily business. So we're seeing a couple of different functions in those two groups. In the center, we see a church building in the back with 3 niches, of course, the Trinity being referred to with a group of 3. And we see this, instead of desert landscape and background, this verdant green that we have. So grass, and then all kinds of flowers and plants that are sprouting up, because the church and the faith is to be a source of life. Life both for believers, but also offering life to the rest of the world. So all kinds of things that are being signaled here. And we see in the very center niche, framed by that arch that you see above it, St. Paul. So Paul the Apostle as being a pivotal figure, and then he is flanked by 2 groups of the church fathers, the Western church fathers and the Eastern church fathers. So what's significant about that is that in the 19th century, here in Rome, we were dealing with unification, the question of unification, politically, in terms of a sense of a cultural identity, as Italians, but also the question of the church itself. And St. Paul's was really interested in pursuing this question of unity. And so including the Eastern Church Fathers with the Western Church Fathers is signaling that kind of interest in unity. And for my students, I just want to point out that Paul is flanked by St. Augustine, okay, and by his spiritual father, who was one of the other important fathers who brought him to faith and baptized him, Ambrose. So these are things that we're talking about, so the significance of those pivotal figures. Another really significant phenomenon that you see in this lower band that follows tradition in the Western Church and Italian art is the inclusion of portraits of contemporary people for particular significant characters in the biblical stories or in the renderings that you're seeing. And so both Ambrose and Augustine, Ambrose is actually a portrait of J.P. Morgan, who was actually influential in this church in the 19th century, one of the captains of industry in America. And then Augustine is, his face is based on the image of the Bishop of Canterbury, so a British, churchman there. So all of these contemporary, references, bringing these universal truths into the present moment as a kind of implication. If we continue to move Sorry, give me a breath right here. If we continue to move to the right on the lowest band, you'll see another group of women, and that is representing the Virgin Mary and other saints. So both men and women are included here as playing critical roles in the work and the life of the church across history. And then on the far right is a group that is often referred to as Christian warriors. Okay, use that term loosely. But some of you probably remember hymns like Onward, Christian Soldiers, things like that. That wasn't necessarily literal battle, although sometimes that's what it ended up undertaking. But again, the role of winning the world, both for Christ and battling on its behalf, so to speak. And so you'll see them represented on horses, in what would have been kind of the commonplace way of representing warriors. And again, we've got a really, really interesting group of people here, and I encourage especially my students to come up here and say, do you recognize some of these people? Because if you look closely, you probably should. So for example, we see Ulysses S. Grant represented as one of these. Garibaldi, who was the kind of revolutionary unifier of Italy. So again, America and Italy bringing those two worlds together in this place. And then my special favorite, Abraham Lincoln, and of course remembering the importance of Lincoln and that we're dealing with the decades that follow his role in the United States and his assassination. So there's a whole lot going on here that's really significant, but all of this emphasis on the realities of what